One day, a man encountered a small child, a small little girl, and there she was, but she was with her older brother. And she asked the older brother, "Does she talk?" And the older brother replied, "No, her teeth have come in, but her words haven't yet." I remember when our children were small, Elizabeth and our 3 children were small, and I remember them learning to talk. It's an amazing thing. You want your child to learn to talk. You want it so badly. But then they start learning to talk. And some of them don't stop talking. But they would start talking, they'd discover a word, one word. And they would play with that word. They'd say it differently. They'd use it. They'd try to use it. They had such joy in just saying the word. They'd smile. They get so excited. And we get excited too. We preachers sometimes do the same thing with words. We discover a word and we get excited. I mean, I once went to a church went to a service in a church, and the minister had found a powerful word. And sometimes we do that. We find one word and we get so excited about it we can't hardly let go of it. And he found this one word, and it was in the King James Bible, oddly enough, and it was called whithersoever. Say that with me. Whithersoever. He said that word at least 50 times in that sermon. I don't know what he preached on other than whithersoever, okay? Whithersoever. He loved that word. He was fascinated with it. And we do the same thing all those preachers do. We find a word or we find an expression in the gospel, and we get excited about it in a given moment, and we find it so helpful, and so we play with that word, and we use it in a variety of spoken places. We write it in written communication. We even walk around the office, sometimes talking to our staff and everyone we encounter about this word. I think that may have been what happened to Paul in this passage from the second letter to the Corinthians. About 2/3 of the way through this wonderful letter, Paul starts using one particular word over and over and over again. And by the time he finishes using this word in the letter, Paul has used this word 9 different times. He obviously likes this word. And the word he uses, of course, is the word eagerness. Eagerness. In some translations, the word is earnestness or zeal or enthusiasm. But the most accurate translation probably is eagerness. Eagerness. You see, Paul doesn't use this word very often in all the rest of his writings. It doesn't occur very often at all. However, in this letter, he decided to use it, or he discovered it and decided it was to be used extensively. And so he plays with the word. He savors it for a while. He enjoys this word. And then he moves on. At one point, at the height of his use of this word in this letter, in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 7, Paul pays a special compliment to that church, the Corinthian congregation. Paul speaks of the spirit of this congregation, a spirit which undergirds every aspect of their life together, every dimension of their life together. Paul says it this way to the congregation. He says, "You are rich in all you have, faith, speech, and knowledge, in your eagerness to help and your love for us." You're rich in all that you have, in your faith, in your speech, in your knowledge, in your eagerness to help, and your love for us. I can't imagine, I can barely imagine what that congregation must have felt when they heard those words from Paul. To hear those words, just imagine if someone came and said those words right here at Chapel Hill. How would you feel about your faith, about your church, How good those words must have made them feel. Here we have Paul. Paul, who was the founding parent, if you will, of that church, the chief organizer, the spiritual guide for the whole Christian movement in that part of the world. And he's sending this word. He's sending this energizing word. He's sending this encouraging word. He's sending this very, very affirming word about who they are. You see, he's sending this word, and you say, well, it must have been ideal there in Corinth, right? A perfect little community right there. No. He sends this word to the Corinthian church, and they're in the midst of problems. Things are not easy. Things are tough. You see, we should never read this letter without realizing the problems that these people were facing, that Paul is addressing here. The Corinthians knew that they weren't perfect. They knew that. They'd stumbled, they'd fallen. They were not a perfect people. The church had fallen short in so many numerous ways. They knew they'd made some serious mistakes. They'd made serious mistakes as individuals in the life of that church. They'd made mistakes as a congregation. They were fallen people. But the congregation was deeply, deeply loved by the Apostle Paul. They were special to him. So that even in the face of all their mistakes, Paul still loved them. Paul still loved them. And so he writes the church and he shares these words. And he does this writing and shares these words out of a great love for them. Out of a deep and profound respect, out of a confidence in the future of this congregation. This is the context out of which Paul shares these words. You are rich in all that you have. Faith, speech, and knowledge. And in your eagerness to help and your love for us. You're rich. In spite of all the things that you may have done wrong and all the imperfections and all the mistakes, you are rich. You see, the text comes in the midst of a series of stirring affirmations by Paul. Paul affirms the Corinthian church for their eagerness, for their excellence, excelling, if you will, eagerness and excelling in faith. Their eagerness and excelling in speech. Their eagerness and their excelling in knowledge. And their eagerness and excelling in their love for him. This is a wonderful series of positive strokes that he's giving this congregation of people. He tells them, you're rich in faith. They have a deep commitment to the gospel. They have a deep and profound commitment to the good news of Jesus Christ. They're rich in their knowledge. They've studied. They have studied and learned the major issues of faith. They've studied and learned the major theology of the faith, and they believe in this faith, and they've come to know it through knowledge. And you're rich in speech. They not only know the faith, they know how to talk about the faith. To talk about the faith that they so deeply and dearly hold in their lives. To witness. They're witness, and they're rich in love. They have a strong and caring connection. A caring connection with each other. A caring connection certainly with the Apostle Paul. And Paul then calls for all this eagerness, all this excelling, all this to spill over into generous financial offerings. You see, Paul wants the Corinthian congregation to become not only eager in all this, but also to be eager to give. Paul wants us. Paul would want us gathered here today to be just as eager. Eager to give. Eager to give. This call for eagerness to give is given by Paul in an economic equivalent of a tough time, right? Many people in Corinth were very poor. They were very poor. Many of these first century Christians have been tested. They've been tested over and over again by all kinds of difficulties. Many of them were very poor. Many of them have been persecuted for their faith. Their resources were very limited. Yet Paul knew they needed to develop an eagerness to give. They needed to have an eagerness to give. And Paul knew the eagerness was there already in that church in Corinth. Paul knew his job was to help them find the eagerness to give at even a deeper and more profound level. It'd be safe to say that all times have a degree of difficulty to them. You see, the church these last 2,000 years experiences all kinds of difficulty, all kinds of challenges. The church has thrived, though. The church has thrived in those difficult times in spite of the difficulties. Maybe this is just the way of the world. The way the world is and the way the world is going to continue to be. Yet the church must continue to have an eagerness about it. An eagerness in all that it's about. An eagerness even, an eagerness to give. An eagerness to give again and again and again and again. Well, let me share with you just a couple of stories about what this eagerness to give looks like. When I was first appointed to my first church as the pastor, there was no associate. It was just the pastor and the part-time secretary and the custodian that showed up from time to time. That was it. I was my first appointment. I arrived there in mid-June, and I discovered that this church, this little church, who'd been told by my predecessor that it was going to be shut down within a year or two, which it wasn't going to be, but they told him that anyway. They had a budget of about $70,000. And so I arrived. I was excited. It was my first appointment. Here I go. And I walked in the door, and I don't think it was a day had passed, maybe two. And someone arrived, the finance committee chair, and it pointed out to me that the curriculum bills and the insurance were now $5,000 in arrearage. Now think about that. $5,000 in arrearage. And not only that, the apportionment, the missional giving, they'd paid 10% in the first 6 months. That put me quite a ways in the hole as I understood it. About $12,000 or $14,000. Well, I learned real quick that you have to have an eagerness to give, because in walked a guy about a week later. His name was Doc. He was a retired veterinarian. And Doc said to me these words. I'll never forget these words. He says, "Well, Mark," he said, "don't worry too much about it. It's no step for a stepper." I said, "That's easy for you to say. No step for a stepper." And so I prayed. I prayed and I talked to the church, and the church responded to that challenge. And they became eager in their giving. And I can tell you, I think it was about December 30th, all our bills were paid for that year. A couple of years later, they decided they wanted to build a building. It's a building they've been waiting on for 25 years. They've been waiting to build this, but they've been talking about it for 25 years. Do you ever notice about a building that people talked about for a long time? 25 years they've been talking about this building. And they had about $40,000 or $50,000 in the bank. It was going to cost a little over $200,000, we found out. And so they agreed that they'd build it. When they had 50% of the money in the bank, they would start construction. I thought, well, that's a good plan. That's a safe plan. That's a sure plan. That's no problem. Well, they voted on construction. They voted in late May. And they said if they had the money, 50% of the money, by the end of the summer, by Labor Day, they would start construction. Well, that was 3 months away. I thought, oh, that's no problem, surely. Well, lo and behold, they said, well, but we can't start any campaign until after harvest, Mark. Well, that's July. So now we're down to 2 months. 2 months. Well, the harvest was weak. By the way, harvests are always weak out in wheat country. And so the preacher became nervous. It's sort of like when the oil prices go down. The harvest is weak, you get nervous. And 1 week prior to Labor Day, we didn't have the money. But you know what happened? By Thursday of that week, we had $101,000 in the bank. They had eagerly given once again. We've seen it here. We've seen it here in just these first 12 months or first 16 months or however months we're up to now. I remember this campaign last year, and we came out of this campaign and we had the most amazing results. We had a strong commitment. More people, more commitment to grow in their faith through this form of discipleship. I remember when we announced we were going to do the sign project, and then we did the portico project, and we anticipated both those projects to take a couple of months to raise the money. We raised both those amounts in 10 days. Imagine that, 10 days. We're still trying to catch up on the portico project. Eagerness to give. Eagerness to give. That is the spirit that Paul speaks of in this text. In spite of uncertainty, in spite of the winds of change, in spite of the setbacks, and in spite of all the financial reversals that might come their way, God provides the Spirit which gives us an eagerness to give. Hear that again. God provides the Spirit that gives us an eagerness to give. This Spirit becomes powerful in the life of the congregation and individuals in ways that they never imagined. Get caught up in that Spirit. God provides a unique celebrative eagerness, an eagerness to continue the work of the kingdom, an eagerness to advance the work of the kingdom, an eagerness to accelerate the work of God's kingdom. God creates a powerful impatience among us, and we desire to give as a movement of the Holy Spirit. We have that desire because the Spirit has given to us a vision for a future, a kingdom future. Let me tell you a story about a place, though, without that vision. The story is told about a small town in Maine who was scheduled to be flooded. The Army Corps of Engineers was going to flood that town because they were going to build a large dam and just flood the town. Well, the most painful part of the whole thing was what happened in the period of time from the time the Corps announced they were going to flood the town and the time they actually flooded the town, because people just gave up. All the improvements and repairs ceased immediately in the town. Why fix anything? I mean, why paint a house when you know it's soon going to be covered by water? Why would you repair a building if the whole town was going to be wiped out in a matter of weeks or months or a year? Why worry about the potholes in the street? You think the potholes are bad here in Oklahoma? You should have been in that town. Why worry about graffiti on the walls? Week after week, month after month, that little town became more and more run down. You see, when there's no faith in the future, there's no power in the present. When there's no faith in the future, there's no power in the present. Say it with me. When there's no faith in the future, there's no power in the present. God has given each of us a certain faith in the future. We've been given a faith in the future. The fruit of that faith are eagerness to finish the course before us. The fruits of that faith are an eagerness to dream boldly, an eagerness to grow in the faith. Remember the old radio host Casey Kasem? Anyone remember Casey Kasem? Used to do America's Top 40 Countdown. Casey always closed his show with these words. He says, remember, you know these words, keep your feet on the ground and reach for the stars. Reach for the stars. That's the kind of eagerness needed among us today in the church. We need to keep our feet on the ground, maintain a degree of wisdom and common sense, and be deep grounded and rooted. However, we must never cease to reach for the stars, to reach toward the very best, the kingdom goal that God is calling us to. That's especially true if we affirm the purpose of the church in the world today. The church is God's given instrument of hope and promise for the world. The church is the God-given instrument of hope and promise for our world. Finally, Paul concludes his statement to the Corinthian church and says, your eagerness has stirred up most of the others. Your eagerness here in the church is contagious. It's stirred up other people. Eagerness generates more eagerness. Eagerness is a positive addition to all Christian disciples. Eagerness is contagious. So watch out for those folks that get eager in the life of the church. Don't get too close to them because it might rub off on you. I invite you to let your eagerness for a thoughtful faith, a creative faith, for a loving community, for that eagerness to be linked to your eagerness to generously give financially. Such eagerness will energize and strengthen your whole life and the family of God's whole life, the life of discipleship. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.